Where does the idea that fairies are insect-like little beings come from? And this is something that is pretty common in some demographics today. It's when you see all those videos getting shared around that are clearly things like mayflies or moths or other kinds of bugs, and people are claiming this is a fairy, sort of rooted in this idea that we find in more modern pop culture that kind of directly equates fairies to insects and often depicts them in insect-like ways. So think, for example, the Spiderwick Chronicles, think of the 2015 movie Strange Magic, sort of blurring the lines between them being insect-sized and with wings and them actually being in some way insect-like. And this is a very modern idea for people who are familiar with older folk belief or a lot of culturally specific folk belief, and even today, we really don't find this at all. Fairies are seen as generally humanoid. Even kind of that last 100 years where we start to see them with wings, they're still like little human people with insect-like wings. And I'll do a separate video on about where the wings themselves come from. But the idea that they're insect-like or connected to insects or appear similar to insects, this is something that is growing out of Theosophy, which was a spiritual and occult movement in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And that particular approach did directly equate fairies to insects. They compare the life cycle of fairies to the life cycle of moths, for example. They also actually have a pretty profound impact on a lot of other ways that modern pop culture and in many cases modern pagans view fairies, but particularly the direct connection to insects comes in from here. Now, yes, it is true. In Shakespeare's material in the 17th century, not all of it, not A Midsummer Night's Dream, for example, but in things like Romeo and Juliet, where Mercutio is talking about Maud as the queen of the fairies, or correct myself, not the queen of the fairies, the midwife to the fairies. Her being a fairy queen came later. He does talk about her having a carriage that is created from different insect parts, things like that. So the idea of fairies kind of being that same general range of size in English belief specifically does go back a bit further, but even in that example, the fairy herself, who did not have wings, was described as human-like in appearance. It was the idea that she was tiny like an insect, and therefore the things that she had like her carriage would have been built out of insect parts effectively. But that direct equation is something that's coming in the 20th century and the early 21st century, growing out of that Theosophy, they're similar to moths kind of concept.